So a couple days ago, I was out at the Fairy Creek blockade where old growth logging protesters are camped, and have been camped for a number of months. And this is just to give some thoughts on old growth logging, particularly in my riding of Cowichan, Malahat, Langford. Uh, I fully support these guys who are blocking the old growth logging. 100%. 100%. And I'll tell you why. And some of my supporters are not going to like me for this, but I'm going to ream you guys out a little bit as well. Not harshly, but enough to make you think. Anyway, the reason I support the protesters at Fairy Creek is because old growth logging should have ended at least 30 years ago. For anyone that has ever been in an old growth forest, and unfortunately that's a very small percentage of the population, anyone that's ever been in an old growth forest knows the sacred, I hate that word sacred, I'm not even going to use the word sacred. They know the spiritual value of old growth forests. They feel it. They feel it in the same way as when you go into a giant cathedral that's been around for hundreds of years, and you can feel there's an essence to it. And there will be people that don't feel that. And those will be the people that are saying right now, oh, well, what's the big deal, Mark? It's just a bunch of big old trees. Why can't people just go and cut them down and make a few bucks from them? And to those people, I would say, look, you have a spiritual weakness in the same way that somebody who's fat has a physical weakness. There's 4 realms of health: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. If you are weak in the physical realm, then it's very clear that you'll probably be fat, or you'll have some sort of condition of some kind that's preventing you from fully living life. And people that are physically healthy will always tell you the same thing. There are certain common truisms in life. So physical health, well, eat well, get exercise. Period. Mental health, love yourself. It's as simple as that. Emotional, accept all emotions as equal, but learn to challenge the emotions to positive use. And spiritual requires trust and faith that there is something larger than yourself here in the physical day of now and physicality. There's more to life than just flesh and bone. And if you're spiritually weak, then you're going to have to look to those who are spiritually strong. And those who are spiritually strong will always tell you the same thing. Something like an old growth forest has a deep connection to something that's well beyond the here and now. And it's intangible, but it's real. And there's a reason that is the reason we must protect old growth forests. You can talk about biodiversity and ecosystem services and all that other BS if you want. But there's something that takes the human soul to a level that can't be articulated logically. And it's for that reason, that kind of spiritual health, that Fairy Creek needs to be protected. Period. Flat out. Full stop. Needs to be protected. And in fact, we have destroyed so much old growth forest in this province that it is a worldwide crime. I would call it a crime. We only have 2% of old growth forests left. They need to be protected 100%. No ifs, ands, or buts. Now, other people will say, oh, Mark, but what about jobs? Well, again, you know what? This is not actually about jobs. If it was about jobs, then what we would find is, as more old growth forests are cut down, employment would go up. And yet that's not what we see at all. Quite the opposite. We see that as timber harvesting goes up, and has been going up since World War II, employment has been going down. So this is not about jobs. So then you might ask, well, why is it the jobs are falling even though timber harvesting is increasing? And this comes back to government. Government is to blame. Actually, unions are to blame too. Fucking unions. Look, if you're a business and you want to employ somebody, then you should be able to employ somebody without having all of these rigorous regulations on top of you, especially regulations that make no sense. It's just paperwork. Anybody that's ever worked in an office or worked for a business, or hell, I worked in a university, and every year I saw the paperwork go from 1 page to 2 pages to 3 pages to a fucking manual. And that's administrators adding on regulations that don't need to be there. And if you do that to business, and you add regulations on top of regulations, on top of regulations, on top of more regulations, as Pierre Poilievre would say, these gatekeepers are pretty much screwing everything up. Businesses will not want to hire human beings. They'll want to buy robots that may cost a little bit more to begin with, but there's a hell of a lot less problems with robots than there is with a human being that comes with reams of government paperwork. And this has nothing to do with the workers until they start complaining about things and suing their employer and making it difficult for them. This is about businesses that want to be able to just hire a person and get some work done, period. Government, in its arrogant ways, has been adding more and more complications onto that for decades. And that's where the real problem lies. Government needs to back away from strangling businesses with paperwork. And unions need to back off from demanding all of these extra regulations. So there's really two people or two realms that are involved here. The problem is not old growth logging. The problem is government getting in the way and unions getting in the way. And if you want to vote NDP, you're pretty much guaranteed that unions who support NDP will add even more regulations, and you'll end up with even fewer jobs. If you want to vote for Greens, well, they've got another problem. The Greens, and I'm going to say this as somebody who used to be almost a card-carrying Green member when I was in my 20s. The Greens, they actually have some pretty good ideas. The problem is they get so hysterical about them that they lose all sight of the narrative. And what's worse than that is they fall prey to one particular problem: the noble savage narrative. There's this idea that if you just make somebody better, the world will be a better place. Or if humans could just be better, then the world would be a better place. Well, humans, I can tell you, are not going to be changing anytime soon. But the noble savage narrative for the Greens keeps ending up in the First Nations camp. And what I mean by this is they keep believing that if you just hand everything over to First Nations, because they're inherently better than everyone else, they will do things better than everyone else. Well, I hate to tell you, but that's a bunch of bullshit. I mean, Teal Jones is a First Nations company. They're doing the logging. It doesn't matter who is in charge of these things. First Nations are not inherently better people. Don't believe that this noble savage idea that because they're, closer to the land, that they're inherently better people. Don't get me wrong. There are some extremely wise people who are First Nations. But you know what? There are also extremely wise people who are not First Nations. There are things that our broader society can learn from First Nations people, particularly because First Nations have been here for so long, they understand the land better than, say, newcomers do. But to think that they're inherently better people is wrong. If you want to vote green, then that's what you'll get. You'll get the noble savage idea. That's what you're voting for, is the false, moralistic, noble savage idea. The problem with the Greens is precisely that. They keep believing that if you put First Nations people into some sort of position of power, that they will inherently do a better job. That's bullshit. Don't fall for it. What matters is people who can actually sit around the table, talk to one another in a reasonable, logical way, and figure out solutions together that are practical, that are based on both quantitative knowledge, spiritual health, mental health, physical health, emotional health. All of these things must be present in an individual if they are to, form government and work with people to find solutions to the problems that we have. But I can tell you right now, when it comes to old growth logging, we should have stopped 30 years ago. When I was at UVic, that was back in the 90s. We were dealing with old growth logging, Carmanah, Walbrand, Clayoquot. And at that time, the NDP had promised to do something about it. And in fact, under their core process, the provincial core process, it looked like they were going to do something. And there was a bit of a positive outlook. The future was going to get better. Well, goddammit, 30 years later, nothing's changed. This NDP government, since the early 90s, has done pretty much nothing. Well, it's done a little bit, but it's never really lived up to its promises. And the reason it does it is, my guess, the reason it does it is it falls prey to the idea that this is an issue about jobs. It's not an issue about jobs. This is an issue about government saddling society with regulations that should never be there. Companies should be able to hire individuals to do a job without it being onerous upon them. And it's very, very simple. Everyone wants clarity in life. People want to know that the remaining old growth forests are protected 100%. The rest of the land, and there's plenty of land that's in forestry right now, there's plenty of land. People who have jobs in forestry want to have certainty, knowing that their jobs are safe, that they can feed their families, and they can have a fairly decent life. And that they're just left alone by government, for Christ's sakes. So you know what? We're all on the same side. But it's a matter of actually sitting down and figuring out, where are the actual problems? What are the actual solutions? And I can tell you, don't get confused by making this a First Nations issue. It's not. Don't get confused by making this a jobs issue. It's not. This is about practicality and common sense. I'm Mark Hecht. I'm with the People's Party of Canada. We're all about common sense, freedom, responsibility, fairness, and respect. All right, that's all I have to say.